All right, so welcome to the Quadruple D, and this is episode 64, part 3, and we're looking at Harry S. Truman's atom bomb attack. He is part of the Fetid Fever Dream Flashback of the Week series that I have on this podcast. Yes, Harry S. Truman is on this list now. So, the relevance to the previous two episodes is Strom Thurmond was the Dixiecrat candidate in opposition to the Democratic president, Harry S. Truman. So remember in the last episode, I did talk about Strom Thurmond and his foul legacy. And this time I'm getting into Harry S. Truman and his own scandal, the kind of one of the biggest scandals anyway, the atom bomb dropping thing. So I'm also going to be assessing this from sort of I'm going to be looking at how this part of history actually, in my opinion, validates radical critiques of power or anarchic critiques of power. And I'll let you be the judge of that, of course, but we're going to get into like how these people in positions of authority tend to actually validate critics of power. So the biggest controversy tied, or one of the biggest controversies tied to Harry S. Truman is his decision to use atomic weapons against Japan in 1945 during World War II. So if you look at the decision itself, it happened in August 1945. Yes, the US dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The immediate death toll was massive, and many more died later from radiation exposure. Truman approved the strikes, arguing they would force Japan's surrender and avoid a prolonged invasion that could cost even more lives on both sides. So, why is that seen as a scandal? Well, I mean, think about it like this. If somebody dropped an atom bomb on you, would you be happy about it? Well, you wouldn't be able to protest anyway because you'd be vaporized pretty fast, like, in the blink of an eye in many cases. So, yeah, you probably wouldn't be too happy about that. And that's one of the fascinating things about it. Like, it's always easier to be pro war or be pro doing this specific terrible thing when it's not happening to you or somebody you care about, right? Like you can way more easily be pro war if it's not you that's being impacted. Well, unless you have a conscience, then it shouldn't bother you that much. If you have empathy, then you should feel almost the same as if it was happening to you. You would understand that. And apparently, what we have found out over the decades and decades is that some people they just lack empathy. They don't understand it intellectually, and they also don't feel it. They can't feel it emotionally, and that's what gets me about this because I'm not the most emotional person. I don't always cry when a person might be expected to cry, but I understand like emotion. I do have emotions. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I'm completely devoid of feeling. I do have feelings and empathy and all that kind of stuff, but I just as much, or maybe even more, understand empathy intellectually because it's a very simple premise. The ability to picture yourself in somebody else's shoes. You don't need to feel that strongly about it. Even it's just a simple intellectual enter not enter exercise. Like there's no elaborate imagination required for most scenarios, especially if it's a scenario that's as stark as this one. There's a big nuclear fireball. Well, it's not that hard to imagine feeling like that's a big deal. So, yes, the civilian targeting was, of course, a major part of the scandal. The bombs killed large numbers of non combatants, And how would you feel if that happened to you, if you were just, an ordinary citizen trying to go about your daily life? You might not even be the biggest fan of the government. You might even be a critic, however vocal or however silent. You might just mumble and grumble about the government, but you might not necessarily even be a fan of what your government is doing. But here you are paying the ultimate price, the ultimate sacrifice for whatever it is that your government has done. So, that's something to really consider here. And, to sort of morally put all that weight on you as if you were supposed to be the one who was supposed to change your government. Like that's how this so often happens when people look at these societies and criticize them. The societies that we go to war against. We're like, well, they didn't work to change their system, so now we have to go to war with them. Well, it's not always so easy to change whatever system you're under, even under a supposedly democratic system like the United States. Obviously, things can be at a standstill. People can be very stubborn and gripping to power, and the two-party system is quite heavily entrenched. And then you've got the military industrial complex and the private prison industrial complex, all of this kind of stuff. It's very daunting to think that, the citizens can very, very easily change all of that, especially when, your ass is kind of on the line in a lot of cases if you uh, are too critical of the government, So it's quite something to say of, oh, these people in this country or that country should be changing their system. And well, there were alternatives too. At least some historians argue that Japan was already close to surrendering, or that a demonstration of the bomb might have sufficed. So even people who, might have been in favor of, at least showcasing the atomic bomb as a threat, even they might have a point. And, there's also a suggestion that the bombings were partly meant to send a message to the Soviet Union as the Cold War was beginning, so it wasn't even just a strategic thing purely for Japan. And there was, of course, a moral precedent. It marked the first and only use of nuclear weapons in war. And that's something that drives me nuts because right now, as I speak, we are waging a war against Iran and their civilian population, because they supposedly were hell bent on getting nuclear weapons for war. But of course, they were not actively doing that. There's no strong evidence that they were actively doing that. And the United States, as I'm talking about right now, is the only country to have used nuclear weapons on another country. So we are the last country on earth that should be able to finger wag at anybody else and say, no, you can't drop atomic bombs, because quite literally these countries could say, well, we learned it from you. You know what I mean? Like it's the most hypocritical thing on earth. And it drives me nuts that people basically across the political spectrum, even people who are basically in my camp, ostensibly on the left or whatever, they rarely seem to bring up that critique. And it's a very simple critique. It's something that should be really one of the first go to arguments that we would make against war in general. And when it comes to things like the war in Iraq and the now ongoing attack on Iran, that is supposedly about the demonic leaders' intention to get nuclear weapons. And of course, Israel has nuclear weapons as well, and nobody's talking about that. It's just so hypocritical and bizarre that we talk about nuclear weapons in this one country, but oh no, there's no way we can criticize our own nuclear dropping nuclear bomb dropping history. So there were other Truman era scandals like corruption in some government agencies, but none approach this in scale of lasting global impact, I would say. So what about the radical anarchic perspective here? So from an anarchic standpoint, the issue is less about Truman as an individual and more about the structure of state power. You've got the concentration of authority, and anarchists argue that no single leader should have the power to make decisions that kill hundreds of thousands. The atomic bombings, they really show you how centralized states can act with little direct accountability to ordinary people, and they can bomb and destroy plenty of ordinary people. And it's also violence as a tool of the state, obviously. The bombings are an extreme example of how states justify mass violence in the name of national interest. And anarchic theory tends to reject the legitimacy of such justifications altogether. And there's, of course, the dehumanization and distance aspect of it. Modern warfare, especially nuclear weapons, creates distance between decision makers and victims. And from this lens, it becomes easier for governments to treat populations as mere abstract targets. You know, it's easier to dehumanize people when they're away, and now we even have like drone attacks and AI involved, so that even makes it more abstract, and there's more of a distance between the attacker and the attacked. Now it's like you just draft a plan, and it's borderline being automated at this point. And that's, I mean, in some ways it pretty much is literally automated, although I'm sure there are still some human decision making elements involved. But really, I mean, what this also demonstrates is that not only are we abstract targets potentially, but really, when you think about it, the system just kind of treats people like they are easily replaceable with machines. Like your hopes and your dreams, your interests, and your life story, they don't matter. They can be literally vaporized in a flash. And the government doesn't care one iota about whatever sort of aspirations you have, your life story, your family history. None of that matters. It's all just an abstract thing that can be easily just, I guess, flushed down the drain, flushed down the toilet.